When did the museum start? What was the first artifact? Well, we created the museum in 1984 when my book Fire Lookouts of the Northwest came out. We started getting items from various people. Some of it was legal, some of it wasn't, so we had to think about how to accept them, and so we went to the state and got a nonprofit corporation organized. We had 11 board members, and that allowed us to accept items from the agencies that was either confiscated. Radios, some of the radios that were confiscated, after they were disposed of, we were able to take them. And things like that, signs and small items mostly. But the first item was a 1913 Osborne Firefinder. And I used that as a key to attract people to my desk and my table that I had selling books at different functions, different Forest Service functions, different agency functions. And it came to us by a collection that was over in at McCord Air Force Base. A gentleman by the name of Bob MacDonald was the forester for the Air Force at McCord Air Force Base. And he collected everything and anything he could get that was forestry related. And when he passed on, we ended up with his collection. So that's how we got that and many other things you're about to see. What led us to create a museum and open it up to the public when it was our home? Well, over the years we planted over 400 evergreens on our 1 acre, and they all grew tall, and it created an urban wilderness right in Spokane. 1 acre, but a wilderness wild. And so we thought, well, we had 37 different evergreen trees, so we labeled those, and we have a trout pond, and we can open our yard up to the public and show them our lookout and our barn with all the fire equipment in it. So that's how it all happened. When we created the board of directors and opened it up as a public museum, but by appointment only because it is our home. What led me to have an interest in fire lookouts anyway? It all began when I was 4 years old, as we've told in the story of the lookout that Dad took me to when he was a radio technician. Well, now fast forward to when I was 16. I went to work for the Washington Division of Forestry as a fire crewman at OMAC on a 10-man fire crew. Well, I ended up on Eneas Lookout. I was 16 years old then. Spent the summer on the lookout. I couldn't cook. I wanted to go squirt water on fires all my life, and that's where I ended up after that 1 year on the lookout. From there, I started collecting things, and it's just grown from that. Was it hard chasing lookouts when you had a whole family of 4 children? And the answer was no. I had a very supportive wife who recognized the need for an activity during a 6-month siege that I had when I was off duty with a disability on the fire department. And she said, why don't you sit down and write that book you've always been talking about? And so that's how the book got started, and that was in 1980. Actually, the book had been worked on for 30 years before that, here and there and everywhere, just notes. And when I had visited the lookout, I'd write notes and stories that I gathered along the way. But But Rita would go along with me in the camper, and I visited over 240 ranger stations. And from that, I would seek out the oldest gentleman there. And he'd be usually out stashed in some outbuilding, and the ranger would know he was there. When the ranger had a question that he couldn't answer, he'd run out there and get the answer from the old man. So this old man would tell me a story or two, and then he would say, "You got to go down the road here about 3 miles. There's an old guy that built those lookouts. Or there's an old guy that used to be a packer that packed supplies into those lookouts. You got to go see this guy." So it created a regular spider web of going out from all these ranger stations and seeking pictures and stories from these old timers. And all that ended up in my book. So it went from there. When the book was written and printed and out on the market, people started handing me things, dishes, and it was signs and things that I shouldn't have. It had Forest Service written on them. So that's how we ended up incorporating. But the support I had from my family, Rita was very supportive. I have one son that was on the lookout for 2 summers right out of high school. I have another son that has moved 2 different lookouts. One is on his property. It's an in-service 45-foot tower, 12 miles from the museum. It's considered one of our museum pieces, but when there's lightning, he goes up there and staffs that lookout. And then our third son is radio tech for the Washington State DNR at Colville, and he's responsible for 500 radios and 13 mountaintop repeaters. He's got a big job. Every summer all those radios have to work. So it's in the family. And then I got it from my father, who was a radio tech back in the war years. Do you have a favorite lookout? Actually, I have 2 favorite lookouts. Heaven's Gate in the Seven Devils Mountains, overlooking Hell's Canyon, dividing Oregon and Washington. When I retired from the fire department in 1988, I wanted to go back up on lookout because that would fill a full circle. I started on lookout, and I was in the fire service for the next 35 years, retiring out of the fire service from the City of Spokane Fire Department. I wanted to go back up on lookout. So I had a choice of numerous lookouts that I could have went to as a volunteer. I chose Heaven's Gate because it is situated where it looks into 3 different worlds of the U.S. Forest Service. It looks into Oregon on the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest in Region 6. That's about half of the pie. You take the northeast quarter of this pie-shaped view, the Nez Perce National Forest in Region 1 of the Forest Service out of Missoula. In the other fourth of the view, I look southeast into the Payette National Forest in Region 4 of the Forest Service. Now, if you're acquainted with the Forest Service, each region is its own world, and they each function differently. That's what I wanted. I wanted that experience. So I had a radio in one corner for the Wallowa-Whitman, I had a radio in another corner for the Nez Perce, I had a radio in the third corner for the Payette National Forest. And if you don't think that was an interesting experience, try it sometime. I was turning in fires on the Wallowa-Whitman side, one right after another until there were 13. And they ignored my report. And I got pretty annoyed with them ignoring my reports. I wasn't one of their lookouts. They have their own lookouts, thank you. So that ended up in a fire that, after the 13th fire, it was a lightning strike that my wife and I both saw. It was 35 miles away over on the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest. And we watched it, reported it, and nothing happened. The next day at 10 a.m., that fire blew up. It burned 60,000 acres. It was well over $1 million. It killed 200 cows. It burned over 200 miles of farmers' fences, and it wiped out 2 ranches. The Forest Service got sued for not attacking it. It was an example of the new let burn policy that was new in 1988. When and how did I get involved with the Forest Fire Lookout Association? In 1992, I got a letter from Steve Cummings in Pennsylvania telling how they had just formed this new association, and I got another letter from the outdoor editor of the newspaper in Eugene, Oregon, Doug Newman, and he was wanting to bring this new organization out west, so that's how I became involved, and we said, well, let's have a conference here in Spokane, and we'll have it in our yard. It drew 82 people, and that was the beginning of the Forest Fire Lookout Association in the West. That formed the western branch of the Forest Fire Lookout Association in 1992. How do I think the appreciation of fire lookouts can be nurtured by the youth of today? That's a big one. The Lookout Association is made up mostly of older people that are burning out. And if we don't get replacements from younger people that are able to drive a nail and hack stuff up mountains to help restore a lookout, it's going to die in the vine. So how do we do it? It's going to have to be through the parents dragging these kids up the mountain and getting them interested, or maybe the Fire Lookout Rental Association where they rent lookouts. Something's got to happen to draw the youth into this, or we're going to lose it, and we'll lose the lookouts too. Do people donate items to the collection, or have you found most of the pieces yourself? No, virtually everything in the collection has been donated. The only time I ever buy anything is if I have to. And there are a few thousand items now. How many come to visit? Approximately 200 a year. How did you track down all the information, and how long did it take to complete and draft the book? It really started in the 1960s, but I would say about 30 years went into putting together the materials in the book. I studied every map that was available in the U.S. Geological Survey offices, and I have got a hold of every early map from the 1930s and 40s from the Forest Service, and studied every map I could get a hold of to pinpoint the locations down to the, at least down to the section. And there were 3,300 lookouts involved in those 4 states, so we managed to be able to compile a list of 3,300 of them, 3,340 of them, and there's still more that are being found every year. After 6 tries to have it published, I decided to publish it myself. So I went to the printer in Fairfield, Washington, and the books were bound in Oakdale, Washington, with sewn binding, which is almost unheard of anymore, but we wanted it to be a field book, so it was done with sewn binding and water-resistant paper. And the future plan for the museum We have a memorandum of understanding in MOU with the Stevens County Historical Society in Colville, Washington, to take everything when I am no longer able to take care of the place. The lookout itself, another MOU, is with the Priest Lake Museum in Idaho. And the plan is to move the lookout to the Idaho Department of Lands office at the Kavanaugh Bay Airstrip at Priest Lake. And this will be done whenever I can no longer maintain the place. So the future of the museum will go to a proper museum.